In Fallout, there are a huge number of factions who have emerged from the ruins of the post-war United States. From the Sinister Enclave to the Shadowy Institute, each of these groups came to be forged together by shared values, a unique historical past, and a distinct plan for the future. The latter of which often puts them in direct conflict with the other factions we see. So what is the end goal for each of the main factions of Fallout? We'll start this video off with one of the organizations that technically did exist in the pre-war United States. The Enclave is an organization that claims to be the legal continuation of the former United States of America, which is a statement that is technically true. Originally formed from the high-ranking politicians and military figures of the pre-war government, the Enclave did exist in the pre-war era as a shadow government, with their key goal being to obtain and hold power at any cost. As seen throughout the history of the Enclave, the goal of the group always requires an other, be it the Chinese, communists, or mutants in the present day, for the Enclave to be able to stand against. As if there is an other, they can justify their control and lust for power under the guise of safeguarding people against these threats. The Enclave were one of the best prepared groups for the Great War, with a multitude of pre-war bunkers, military installations, and offshore platforms like the Poseidon Energy oil rig that allowed them to survive somewhat intact after the bombs fell. The chaos of the Great War did separate much of the group from one another, however their goals remained connected. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Enclave, in particular the forces located in Appalachia, were focused on continuing the war with China and eliminating communism wherever it may be. In theory, this was to protect American citizens, however, in practice, even non-Enclave congressmen and senators of the pre-war government that survived the Great War were eliminated, under the ideology that if they were not with the Enclave, they were against them. In this goal to end communism, the Enclave ended up creating the Scorch virus, ostensibly to be used against the Chinese, and tried to gain access to nuclear silos to continue the war. This was the end goal of the Enclave of the distant past, however. The Enclave of the present and future onwards, seen in Fallout 2, 3, and onwards, have had a similar but more devastating goal. The focus no longer fell on the Chinese or communism, but instead on what the Enclave perceived to be mutants. And it was now mutants that threatened mankind. An understandable theory when you look at super mutants, centaurs, Scorch, ghouls, etc. The issue came from the fact that the Enclave considered the rest of humanity, even those preserved within vaults, as mutants of the same category, fit only for extermination. As stated by President Dick Richardson, the only way for true humans and democracy to be safe is to cleanse the mutants from the globe. In practice, this has been seen a variety of ways. Wastelanders on the west coast were abducted and experimented upon to trial as test subjects for bioweapons the Enclave sought to use against the residents of the Wasteland. And in the east coast, President Eden sought to poison the water purifier to wipe out the entire Wasteland population who were not genetically compliant. Essentially, every single person and mutant that was not part of the Enclave, to allow them to lay claim to Washington, D.C. And speaking of pre-war factions, in the pre-war era, Vault-Tec was the most profitable and powerful company in the United States, and it became somewhat synonymous with America itself. Pre-war citizens, although staunchly nationalistic, began to distrust their government after a near decade of war, disease, and uncertainty. In contrast, Vault-Tec was seen as a remedy to the problem brought about by the looming atomic war, with their slogan of being prepared for the future. Heavy advertising of their products and licensing of their mascot Vault Boy on nearly everything helped to ensure that customers came to associate them as a happy, benevolent company who would preserve America as they knew it and guide them into a brighter age. However, underneath the bright blue and gold facade of the company's smile, a monster snarled back. See, despite draping themselves in the values of America, democracy, equality, rule of law, etc., Vault-Tec despised these tenets, viewing them as no longer viable within their grand plan. And as the war dragged on, the United States became more and more impoverished, and subsequently, more and more in debt to Vault-Tec, allowing the survival of mankind to be outsourced to the private sector. The public-facing lens of Vault-Tec was that they would create a series of vaults underground, accessible to as many US citizens as possible, in order to safeguard and preserve them in the event of an atomic war. However, this was only true for a small portion of the population. Vault-Tec had come to view America, as a country, to be a failed state, and one that had no purpose in being preserved for the future, not the least the average Joes and Janes that made up the nation. Instead, they sought to harness the fears of these normal citizens by having them entrust their survival to the company, and then using them as lab rats in Vault experiments that range from cruel to just straight up bizarre. The experiments themselves depended on the financiers. For example, some were commissioned by the Enclave to assess human responses in tight living conditions in their bid to leave the Earth on starships. Others were created by private companies that Vault-Tec allowed to purchase a stake in, with some experiments consisting of 1 man and 999 women. For Vault-Tec themselves, however, the vaults would function as intended and preserve the company and its employees into the future. And this itself became the goal of the company, as when pressed on what would happen when the bombs fell, Barb Howard, a high-ranking Vault-Tec executive, claims that a nuclear event would be a tragedy but also an opportunity. Perhaps the greatest opportunity in history, because when we are the only ones left, there'll be no one to fight. A true monopoly. Vault-Tec ultimately believed that if they were in control of all remaining humans on Earth, there would be no more competition, and therefore no more war, leading to what they proclaimed to be their ultimate goal: peace. However, they did not seem to factor known quandaries such as the Enclave or other Wasteland groups surviving and even thriving into the far, far future. In fact, the NCR itself was formed by residents of Vault 15, and were able to create a vibrant, expansionist nation that espoused pre-war values of democracy and rule of law, better even than Vault-Tec could. And given that this was a direct threat to Vault-Tec's view that only they could inherit the Earth, Overseer Hank McLean destroyed its capital city with a nuclear weapon. Ultimately, the end goal of Vault-Tec can be summed up by Hank, as he declares that if the problems with the world is factions endlessly fighting, endlessly at war, then what is the solution but to get rid of the factions? To make the world us, only ours to shape. Speaking of our friends, the NCR, or New California Republic, the end goal for the NCR could be acutely summed up by one of its leaders, Colonel Moore, who states that the NCR is progress. If you wander around the Wasteland, you'll find all sorts of tribes, villages, and such where people spend most of their lives trying to survive. The NCR gives its people a shot at something more. We have laws, currency, healthcare, government, all the things that were lost. It's not perfect, but it's worth protecting. In its heyday, the NCR was the most powerful post-war faction. It possessed a stable democratic system in a world where citizens can vote for their own elected representative to represent them, be it a mayor, senators, congressmen, and even a president. And this was very impressive on a continent where warlords or tribal chiefs are usual heads of state. Enabled by their robust economy with industries ranging from agriculture, industry, armaments, and scientific endeavours, these millions of Republicans lived at a standard relatively unknown to most Wastelanders. In turn, this also fed their military complex, consisting of a multi-tiered military force ranging from soldiers, special forces, to generals, all seeking to expand and protect the Republic and its citizens. The NCR essentially was achieving its end goals at the time of its last appearance in 2281. The Republic was stretched in multiple directions, most notably in New Vegas, where it was engaged in a multi-year-long conflict to keep hold of Hoover Dam, which provided the nation with a large amount of water and electricity. The fact that the NCR was succeeding in their end goal ultimately was their downfall, because as mentioned previously with Vault-Tec, it flew in the face of Vault-Tec's end goal of having a total monopoly on humanity's survivors. The fact that a fully functional, independent post-war nation was able to thrive in such a way was antithetical to this plan. As a result, the capital of Shady Sands was nuked, and the NCR thrown into disarray. In present day, the NCR is divided. Contingents of the nation are indicated to survive outside of the Los Angeles region, although understandably with much less prestige as they once had. Since Shady Sands is labelled the first capital of the NCR, however, it is imagined that another capital has risen in its place. Moldova holds dominion over the main NCR forces we see in the show, labelled as the NCR Remnants. These forces are evidently die-hard supporters of the NCR, who seek to harness the energy of the cold fusion reactor to provide light and power to the ruins of Los Angeles. Moldova's end goal for the NCR had a lot of merit, as it honestly would have worked. The Brotherhood lay claim to the reactor and look upon the city as it illuminates in the darkness. But if Moldova had been able to retain control of it, the NCR would have been able to reclaim their capital and potentially restart their golden age. And for the next faction, Caesar's Legion. The Legion is described by its founder Caesar as a nationalist, imperialist, totalitarian, homogenous dictatorship that's modelled on the Roman Empire. The Legion is locked in a war against the New California Republic, with the war tied directly to their evolution as a state and Caesar's long-term vision for the Legion. Overall, the end goal of Caesar is to conquer the New California Republic, and through that conquest combine the civilian culture and infrastructure with the Legion's military, creating an entirely new empire. Explaining his plans via Hegelian dialectics, a discord method consisting of both a thesis and a diametrically opposed antithesis, Kaiser ultimately plans to overthrow the NCR Council and rule the NCR as its new dictator, while simultaneously transforming the Legion itself to a standing military force that protects its citizens and his own personal power. The intended consequence of this is a new society, combining the best of both the NCR and the Legion. The NCR military, rather than being made up of career soldiers and untrained conscripts, would be recrafted into an elite warrior caste similar to the Legion. The former NCR civilians under Legion rule now would have very little control over their communities, having no political freedoms or liberties, but would be guaranteed a peaceful and caring lordship so long as they stayed true to Kaiser. However, it is hoped that via the Hegelian dialectic synthesis, the elements of NCR civilian culture would be able to influence the culture of the Legion itself, and through this synthesis, the most self-destructive flaws of the Legion could be phased out. The Legion in its current state is a culture fueled by warmongering, conquest and assimilation. It is described as an all-consuming beast that upon reaching the sea will begin to cannibalize itself. However, upon seizing control of the NCR, the attention of the military will be focused less on conquest of new territory, but the protection of its own. To start this grand plan, Caesar first needs to conquer New Vegas, intending to seize it as the capital for his new empire, comparing it to a new Rome. And given the fact that we're heading back there in Season 2 of Fallout, we might be able to see them if this comes to pass. One of the oldest residents of the Wasteland is one with the grandest end goal for his faction, and that is Mr. House. At 261 years of age, House laid the foundation of his plan more than 2 centuries ago. House had formulated that atomic war was a near certainty in the future, and this was ultimately confirmed after his meeting with Vault-Tec, who revealed their own plans to launch their own nukes to set the stage for their Vault experiments. House evidently had apprehensions about the plan, stating that Vault dwellers would likely turn on one another, and it does seem he did not partake in it himself. Instead, knowing that he could not save the world, he set out to save the one thing he cared for, his hometown of Las Vegas. He installed lasers to the roof of the Lucky 38 Hotel, accompanied by satellite links to disarm or destroy the nukes sent from China. He then preserved his physical body within a hibernation chamber and synced his brain to the online network, effectively causing the Lucky 38 and his Securitron forces to become his body. An operating software upgrade, named the Platinum Chip, was designed to boost the defense network and his robots, and it was meant to be delivered to House on the 23rd of October, 2077. But unfortunately, the Great War broke out 20 hours before it could be delivered. Without the Platinum Chip, most incoming nukes were disarmed or destroyed, but 9 did strike the Mojave. Shortly after regaining consciousness in 2138, the arrival of the NCR in the region alerted House that structured and powerful civilizations had developed in the Wasteland. Knowing that they would set out to lay claim to the Mojave and Hoover Dam, House sought to obtain a position of power. His Securitrons poured out of the Lucky 38, surprised the startled tribals of the region, and offered them an ultimatum: join New Vegas or die. With these recruited allies and his Securitron robots, House was able to force the arriving NCR army to the bargaining table rather than being invaded outright. Vegas' sovereignty was guaranteed, in exchange for 95% of Hoover Dam's power output. The NCR were able to maintain a military base at Camp McCarran and an embassy on the Strip. While this does sound like a bit of a raw deal, this was perfect in House's eyes. For one, Hoover Dam itself would not have been operational without the NCR engineers, and the 5% directed to the Strip was more than enough to supply his small nation state. Allowing the NCR to station forces in the Mojave also gave him the benefit of using them as proxies to deter and defend against Caesar's Legion. And while the NCR bled itself dry of caps and life, House did not need to spend a single cent to protect his own home. The main thing was he took advantage of the NCR troops and citizens, however, who flocked to the strip in droves to spend their money, and it was this that was the true main goal of House. With their projected money pouring in, House sought to invest in the future of humanity. By his projections, 20 years would enable the reignition of high technology development in weapons, robotics and agriculture, all the things lost in the Great War. In 50 years, he'd be able to send people into orbit. And within a century, manufactured colony ships would be launched into space to search for new planets unpolluted by the ravages of war. Of all the factions with a somewhat grand and lofty end goal, House was the most likely to see this through. At the time of this video, however, House's end goal has evidently not been achieved. With Season 2 of Fallout series coming out later in this year, we can see that New Vegas still stands, but it doesn't seem to be the shining jewel of civilization that House had made out that it would be. In fact, it looks lucky to be still standing intact after all this time, much like Mr. House. The Railroad differ from almost every other faction in this video. Whereas most of these factions seek to dominate and control the Wasteland with all the systematic side quests and challenges of having such a huge goal, the Railroad are focused on one sole goal, the liberation of synths from the Institute. I'd also say that they're unique in the fact that they're the only faction whose endgame goal can actually be achieved in-game, in the event that the player chooses to back them in Fallout 4. Historically, the Railroad has fought the Institute from the shadows, as a clandestine organisation using codenames, dead drops and safe houses to ferry synths out of the Institute and out of the Commonwealth. And while they weren't really able to do a great deal throughout their entire history, with the sole survivor, this changes entirely. The Institute is stormed, the Gen 3 synths who wish to be saved are saved, and then the whole place is blown to smithereens. The synths are free to live their lives now, the Railroad's enemies are defeated, and their goals are now complete. I had funnily enough had a whinge in a video about the Railroad before, how they're the worst main faction in Fallout 4, which I kinda still hold to be true, but the props I will give them is that they are actually able to achieve their end goal. While the NCR, or the Legion, or the Enclave have lofty, far-reaching goals to occupy and reshape the waste in their image, the Railroad just want to save synths. It is curious what the internal politics would be, however, given that some in the Railroad believe the early model, Generation 1s and 2s, should also be saved. However, in the best case scenario, they are also wiped out in the assault. I also do wonder if Generation 3 synths would be thankful, given the fact that the only place capable of making others like them was wiped off the planet, and so now they're basically a dying race. Anyway, the Railroad are still the worst main faction in Fallout 4, but at least they're able to realistically achieve their end goal, unlike the rest of these factions. The Institute are one of the longest continuing groups to survive in the aftermath of the Great War, having been founded by the survivors of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology. Trapped under the ruins, the survivors and their children continued to dig further and further underground, until they were separated from the Wastelanders on the surface, physically but also metaphorically. Founded officially in 2210 with a focus on continuing the research and development of technology that the CIT was built on. The squabbles and wars of the residents of the surface were beneath them, although ironically, this was due to the fact the Institute was several hundred feet beneath the Wastelanders. The Institute view themselves as the inheritors of mankind's technological development. While some view the rapid advance of science from pre-war governments as the leading cause of the Great War, the Institute instead see it as the only way for humanity to ascend, to grow, and to evolve. In theory, this end goal is stated to be that they seek to save mankind, with their motto being "Mankind Redefined." In practice, they end up killing nearly every human being they come into contact with that isn't them. The Institute pursues expansion of technology in a way that would make even Andrew Ryan in Bioshock wince. Morality means nothing to them. Wastelanders are kidnapped to be turned into superhumans, with these experiments then released into the world above to murder and pillage. Others are abducted, killed, and then replaced with a synthetic replica that assumes their identity. In an effort to test greater soil yields, a farmer named Roger Warwick was killed and replaced, with the eventual plan to have his family, consisting of young children, murdered once they acquired the data. The Institute is confirmed to once have been involved with the first attempt of a coalition government in the Wasteland. However, this relationship soured over time, although opinions differ. Commonwealth residents state that the Institute purposefully sent a synth agent to kill the representatives, whereas records in the Institute do show a genuine attempt to help the residents and not give up on them. If an Institute playthrough is completed, they assume control over the Commonwealth. Synth forces can be seen patrolling major communities such as Diamond City, as well as checkpoints throughout the region. However, their control is less in a governing sense but more in keeping an eye on the population. Although the Oxford Dictionary is now a thing of the past, the word humanity was once defined as the quality of being humane. It was this word that mankind defined itself as being unique from the other animals of the earth. And yet, the Institute's end goal is to be mankind redefined. If prompted, they would explain this tagline, mankind redefined, as a goal to save humanity through science. The contradiction, however, is that it is human beings that are sacrificed in this goal to save mankind, be it through FEV experiments, synth abductions, or wiping out communities for little to no gain. Sean sums it up by stating that the Commonwealth is dead. There's no future here. The only hope for humanity lies below. The mankind that the Institute seeks to save are themselves. The rest of the planet are simply the bygone remnants of a destroyed world, who are fit for experimentation at best, or extermination at worst. And as the poster child for the Fallout franchise, the Brotherhood have appeared in every single game in the series. Due to this, they are seen to be scattered across the Wasteland, surviving and thriving since their conception immediately prior to the Great War to the present day. The Brotherhood were founded on core beliefs by their founder Roger Maxson, which they adhere to this day, that being to safeguard and preserve technology. In Roger Maxson's original address, the key purpose of this was to secure this technology as they would be used as the building blocks to rebuild civilization, with the Brotherhood being the catalyst to change the world. The doctrine and core tenets of the Brotherhood were laid out in the Codex, considered to be their Bible, which each member of the Brotherhood was to abide by. This mission or end goal of the Brotherhood became somewhat warped over time and distance, as different chapters began to interpret the Codex and their mission somewhat differently. The Brotherhood that we see throughout the series do hold Roger Maxson's ideals close to their hearts. The key goal is to safeguard and preserve tech. However, the reason is given that outsiders cannot be trusted with advanced technology, lest another Armageddon occur. And while being a noble reason, in practice this has led to the Brotherhood being xenophobic and isolationist at best, and warmongering at worst. In fact, the Brotherhood declared war against the NCR under the pretext that the growing nation was recklessly using technology and it was required to keep humanity safe. But fundamentally it was because the Brotherhood felt threatened by their power, and the NCR were sick of the power-armoured thugs storming into their homes and stealing their laser rifles. In recent years, the end goal for the Brotherhood has been viewed less favourably, even by its own members, with Veronica stating that once upon a time their purpose was preserving tech and hoping to outlive the Wasteland population to become humanity's sole heirs, but in practice they haven't grown or adapted to the new world. However, the organisation does have the capacity to be fluid. The Washington DC chapter, under Elder Owen Lyons, were excommunicated for the very reason that they sought to protect the people of the region, not via lofty goals of stealing their plasma weapons, but by actually killing Wasteland threats. A decade later, the chapter was readmitted into the fold under Elder Arthur Maxson, who led a reformist agenda, still adhering to the somewhat revisionist policies of protecting Wastelanders and promoting heavy outside recruitment, but leading the charge on core Brotherhood tenets, such as safeguarding technology, by going to war with the Institute and their synths. The Brotherhood under Arthur Maxson seemed to be the closest to adhering to the original end goal laid out by their founder, as they've taken steps towards nation building. East Coast Brotherhood from Washington DC to Massachusetts, compared to the isolationist hole-in-the-ground format of the other chapters, which has then influenced the wider Brotherhood. The West Coast under Elder Quintus takes orders from the East, at least until they seize the unlimited power from the cold fusion reactor. Elder Quintus had declared that the Brotherhood had lost its way, and a new Brotherhood under his leadership would rise. Although in what format this will be is hard to know until Season 2 comes out. Ostensibly, the end goal of the Brotherhood is to safeguard technology, ensure Armageddon never happens again, and build a new civilization by these building blocks from the old world. In practice, however, the Brotherhood is an arrogant, expansionist group who wield their military might against those weaker than them to gain more power. And that is the end goal of the main factions in the Fallout series. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, you know what to do.